welcome everybody to episode 58 of the Unchained Vodcast. Today we're going to talk about tanking. Specifically, because we've kind of touched on this topic on and off, we're just going to talk about the world of, of tanking specifically, because we have talked about heavy fighters and toughness of certain characters, but we really want to talk into the heaviest of the heavy fighters, people really speccing into being tough and durable, and how that plays out in RVR, which is, of course, notoriously difficult to have any sort of tanking mechanics in there, which is probably why we don't have a true tanking class in the game. So, let's just get started. My first thing I thought we would open up with is something that's probably going to be a little bit all-encompassing. Might cover a few of the other topics I wanted to talk about for later, like I wanted to get into active blocking as a specific topic in a little bit, as well as alternative means for fulfilling tanking roles. But to start us, let's talk toughness. How tough do you feel that heavy fighters are going to need to be able to be? Not necessarily by default, but need to be able to spec into being for any sort of PvP tanking to be viable?
That is a very tough question, because it's a variable situation when you're looking at the PvP meta and the group components, whether you're talking about 8-man groups or full-scale battles with 100 v 100, things change drastically. And at a certain point, the numbers outweigh your stats, and a tank can be basically one shot, if seemingly one shot. It's not actually being one shot, but just completely targeted by a larger group and go down instantly. So the toughness really scales depending on the group size.
And I'd say on the role you want to take also, because if you're actually there to protect your squishy, you're gonna need more toughness to be able to withstand more attacks, to be an actual. For me, part of the roles of heavy fighters is going to be being a meat shield, an actual body blocking projectile. So the more tough you get, the better for that role in particular.
Yeah.
But as we said in previous casts, heavy fighters are not tanks, so they can fill other roles. But to tank in RVR, especially in CU, is going to be much easier because of the fact that magic effects and most projectiles are actually physical, so you can physically block them.
I would agree, but I do think, we know that heavy fighters are not intended to specifically be tanks, because PvP and tanking is not something that really meshes together super well. But with the sheer range of attacks that they've built into the game with mages and archers, I do feel like some people will have to take up a tanking role of a very beefy, extremely tanky character, because I feel like what we're going to see is how do these characters defend the squishier characters when you have multiple sources of very long ranged damage coming in from archers and mages focus firing single individuals. And I actually don't think that sheer toughness is necessarily the just health-wise toughness is necessarily going to answer that. I do think it means that there needs to be a moderately strong degree of variability in their builds with regards to toughness. Some heavy fighters are going to want to do DPS and melee DPS, and they're still going to be tough, but not necessarily really tough. Whereas I think, if you really want to go into being a frontline meat shield with a shield and just forming a shield wall type strategy, then you will need to be able to invest a considerable amount of into soaking up damage.
Yeah, and we've seen this with other MMOs that also have PvE in them, where the balance is kind of split between both systems, PvP and PvE, of people in PvP just kind of going with full health buffs, and they become this indestructible, unkillable force at the sacrifice of really doing anything else besides running And so you have to weigh that balance of, do I want to be indestructible and have all this damage mitigation at the expense of not dealing any damage? And when it comes to PvP, one of the things that tanks can do, or people playing the role of tanks, is to be the threat. Because there is no aggro, you have to find other ways to kind of force a player's willpower for having them want to attack you by being a threat of some kind.
I agree, and I definitely think we'll have to get into the specifics of close range combat. But where my mind's at right now is what we've seen in the game is very long ranges for archers and mages. I mean, the absurd ranges compared to most games. You can't close that distance unless somebody is extremely tanky. Somebody really has to be able to absorb that damage, or you're all getting cut down at long range.
Yeah.
And I kind of agree and disagree with some people in the chat that are talking about the lack of melee combatants. I do agree there's a lack of melee classes for launch. But the reason I said I think there needs to be a pretty broad range of spec in the toughness area for these classes for the heavy fighter is because the heavy fighter, in my mind, is really two classes. All three of them are really two classes. You can either spec it towards DPS, or I should say not based on what we've seen, but on how I see the game pulling out, with that being the only real true melee class, there's no way around it. It's going to have to be able to either do lots of DPS or be really tanky. I think people will be able to blend the two, of course, but I'm just saying I think there needs to be a fair degree of variability on that.
I think people will have to specialize at least in some way, because going for a tank style, so heavy damage mitigation build, will mean you have less. The way you use your weapons is going to be different. You're going to have to build up shield abilities. You can't use dual wielding because you need the damage soaking of a shield. So it will be different. It's going to be the same class, but there's going to be a very wide range of different builds of heavy fighters that are going to be just like the warrior in D&D. Warrior is a very umbrella name for a lot of different builds, and that could be considered different classes. So being a tank, you're gonna be you're gonna have to specialize in soaking up damage because of the range, as you said.
I do agree that you'll have to kind of specialize a little bit into soaking up damage, but from what we've seen with the sample components, at least on the website, most of the tank of the three classes have unique abilities or traits that fully support soaking damage for the intent of then buffing your damage. The more you soak, the more damage you end up doing. I think it's the Black Knight in particular who their sample components talk about that. And then you have the Mjolnir, who actually has ranged attacks with its hammer.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different play going on with it besides just I'm going to absorb damage or I'm going to do damage. They're kind of combining.
Yeah. Well, and I do think to answer Svarty's question, or not question but statement, maybe they should have just called them fighters. I do think they're intentionally called heavy fighters because I think CSE recognizes that all of them have to be tankier than we would normally expect some fighters to be. All of them are going to have to be moderately tough because they've got a lot of ground to cover in open RVR. There's just no way around it. They're not going to be able to get across that field unless they've got a pretty good pool of damage mitigation or health. But I think there's still going to be, even though they've got that elevated toughness, there are some that are going to have that plus considerable damage versus some that are going to have more mediocre damage but really go far into the toughness. And I think that's going to be necessary for the game because otherwise, how do you get the squishier people into range? How do you get your healers up to survive combat if the tanks aren't healthy enough to actually make it across the field to get into melee range? And then no one's going to play the heavy fighters because they can't get across the field to even get into melee range to hit anybody.
And that's a huge problem. And we talk about the lack of melee classes specifically. Now we're talking about heavy fighters and tanking. In MMOs, large scale warfare, tend to favor ranged combat already.
Oh yeah.
Your groups form up into mass swarms and they keep their distance because if you get too close, it becomes that mass swarm versus you, and you're going down instantly. So you always try to stick together, and it's going to be interesting to see how they break that traditional, just natural flow of what's already happening in other MMOs.
Yeah, I think the thing we really don't want to see is a state where a state of affairs where the you can't get into melee range and people just form
Yeah.
walls and shoot at long range at each other, because we have these really long range classes, multiples of them. We have siege weapons, and then we have heavy fighters
Yeah.
and devout or semi closer range, but not really. And then we have the
Yeah.
support, but again, those aren't really damage dealing classes.
For me, I think part of it is because of how it's set up right now for the testing, where there's not really any damage fall off or things like that that are gonna come later on. But still, the game is right now heavily favoring range classes, so that's one other reason to encourage heavy fighters to invest in toughness, because you're gonna have to basically be a meat shield, a wall protecting your range DPS and your squishies from the other range of the other realm. There is, at the moment at least, hopefully that's gonna change, there is little else to do for melee,
Yeah.
um, unless you go into a battle, a siege battle where you have an objective to go to. Um, then it's easier to actually go into melee range because you have to go to an objective. If you're just on deathmatch, there is no incentive into going into melee because you can mow down people as they try to rush you.
Yeah, I mean
Uh,
that's kind of the issue you have. I mean, uh, I don't think you can just ignore tankiness, because these, as I said, the maps are huge, the ranges are huge. Uh,
yeah,
there's no way to stop as you're advancing to stop 3 or 4 archers or mages from focus firing a heavy fighter and blasting them down before they get halfway across the field. And then
yeah,
by the time they get all the way there, half the heavy fighters are dead. The mages and the healers are exposed, just because the other side stayed in rank and decided we're just going to stay here and heal ourselves and shoot you from a range. Or
yeah.
we've got the keep, and now we can just stand at the keep and shoot the crap out of you as you advance and kill half of your heavy fighters. I really think it won't come down to necessarily toughness or stats to fix that, as much as that would contribute to it. I really think that that's going to be. I really think that's going to be they've stated that archers are going to have super long range in the game. They may nerf that, but that's what they've stated the intention is. So I assume archers and mages are both going to continue having super long range. They've stated several times they want the game to have long range. So until they nerf that, that's just seems to be how it's going to be. But anyway, I think what they really have to look into is allowing people to spec into those tougher abilities, but also look into how they want active blocking to work. I think active blocking should be a very powerful mechanic, and that's something I
Yes.
wanted to ask y'all about. Is how do you think they should make active blocking work? Because I think if they made that a very useful skill for heavy fighters, it could help to mitigate a lot of that problem without necessarily requiring everyone to just roll super beefy characters.
Right. Well, it's got to be something that has a degree of strategy to it, timing in particular, and not something that you can just hold your shield up and just block indefinitely. It should require either stamina or blood, some sort of resource that drains the more you
And it
block.
slows you down significantly.
Exactly.
Yeah, I do think there's a bit of. I do agree that it should slow you down. It should consume some stamina to hold up the shield and actively block, so you can't just do it forever. I do think there's a bit of a problem with slowing. I don't think it should slow you too much because then you get into this thing where your whole army has to slowly pace forward. I do think it should slow some to some degree, so they can't just charge, straight in. Um, what I would like to see is that it does slow progression to just hold your shield out like that. It kind of slows you down a little bit, but it's a very powerful mechanic, so there's a lot of incentive to use it, especially against ranged attacks. Maybe it'll still be useful against melee, but not as useful. But to have it be really powerful against ranged attacks, where you can just, if you got that shield up, you're mitigating tons of the damage as long as it's coming from in front. If someone sets up an ambush or they flank around you, totally different story.
And I think tying into that, talking about toughness, it's not as easy as just building to mitigate damage, as there are different damage types. There's piercing, slashing, magic, different types of magic. So you're actually going to be getting very complex with what you, as if you're playing a heavy fighter in a tankish build, what you want to focus on blocking, whether it's being better at blocking archer damage or mage damage. And you're going to have to tie that into what you're doing.
Yeah, and your mic sounds way better at the moment.
Good.
Well, I will say the reason I think it should have slowdown is because I don't think we want people actively blocking, doing nothing but actively blocking in the middle of a melee fight. I don't think we want heavy fighters getting into close melee range and just going, oh, guess what? 90% damage mitigation. And if you don't slow down their speed, or someone mentioned slowing down turning speed, which is also actually an interesting idea. If you don't slow them down or give some kind of a penalty to doing that, there's really not much reason to not do it to block attacks. Yeah. And then the fights just drag out even longer in melee combat, and it becomes almost impossible for anybody to kill them, because as soon as they see them doing an attack, they go, and I'm blocking with my shield, when they're in close range. But I think I think that the idea is you can have them at really long range, and if you have penalties like slowing movement and stuff, that block can be especially powerful to help them close the gap. As soon as you start making it also useful in melee, they have to back it off and start nerfing it more, which is then going to make them more vulnerable to long range attacks if they're paying attention and blocking and everything, because the shield obviously has to be balanced.
Yeah.
I agree, Skylar, that you can't add too much slowdown, because then they can't close the gap at all, and then that's silly.
Right.
No, exactly. And they're good. I think it's actually okay to slow turning speed, because, as Vellic said, you don't want them to actively block all the time. So if you're actively blocking, you can be strafed, but that's your choice. You wanted to block frontal damage. If somebody that's faster flanks you and does more damage, that's on you to drop your shield and try to fight.
Well, yeah, and every mechanic has to have a way to be countered. The way to counter a whole bunch of tanks standing in a line with a shield out is to go around them, or have an ambush or something like that. I also think that I also kind of think that shields should not block, or should be much weaker at blocking AoE attacks, simply because, to me, the purpose of the shield is to block the tank so that they can cross distance, as well as to provide protection and blocking to people behind them. And I would even argue that the shield should perhaps have an area of blocking that's slightly bigger than the shield itself and bigger than the person. So it's not just like right in front of you, but maybe it's a little bit to the side, a little bit up.
Or it depends on the size of the shield.
So that, theoretically they can move the shield around, so you can't be just like, oh, I slipped the shot right past you. No, you've got to really move around them to hit people behind them and stuff. You can't just be like, just to the side. But the perhaps the flip side of that is you can then use AoE attacks, which are, at least balance-wise, should do less damage to individual people, and thus are probably going to be easier to heal for the healers, because they can just do AoE heals to heal up the damage. And then it's kind of the trade-off. They're going, okay, well, they've got lots of people with shields up, so we can just kind of bombard the area with AoE. We're going to do some damage, but we're fighting against their healers at that point, just for them to be able to AoE heal it.
Yeah, but a shield should still be able to block a AoE just in the size of the shield, basically. If you're on one side or the other of the heavy fire, you get hit. Um,
Yeah, but if
it's
it's an
still
AoE
it's still
attack, it
show.
can go around, I mean, obstructions. Just because there's a shield in front of an explosion doesn't mean you're not going to get burned behind the shield. Whereas if
Well,
an arrow hits a shield, that obviously stops it.
Theoretically, it actually should, given their
yeah,
air system and how the interaction system
exactly.
works. It's no different than you standing behind a wall and being safe
Mm,
from the
Yeah,
AoE.
That depends on the size of the wall
It does.
and the size of the
yeah.
explosion.
Also,
Ideally, of course, if you have AoE magic damage, you're shooting it behind the tank,
yes, exactly.
and therefore doing the full damage to him.
Yeah, it's
Mm.
like if you're in a building and it's going to blow up, but there's a wall in front of you that's as wide as your body. I'm pretty sure you're not okay. Just because
There
it
might
doesn't
be
blow up
splash
that wall
damage.
does not mean you're not going to take damage
Sure.
from that. That's why I said I didn't say it doesn't mitigate the damage at all.
Yeah.
But perhaps it should be weaker against AoE attacks or certain AoE attacks or something, so that there is some type of some type of counterplay in
Yeah.
the combat. I mean, they could try to still DPS one person down through their shield, or they can result to saying, okay, it's just AoE attack the area, see what happens. We can at least whittle them down some as they approach.
Just bring down the artillery.
Yeah. Drop different things down there. Let me see. I had some other things.
One of the ideas when we were discussing the topic that I had about the shield blocking actually is not making it a mini game, but making it something that is timed. Depending on how late you raise your shield, basically, or within a certain time frame, you get a bonus to blocking the next attack.
Mm-hmm.
So you have an incentive to not actually always hold your shield, not just because of the resources, because some can build stamina to be able to hold their shield all the time, but to actually raise and lower your shield as you move, giving you a bonus. Say you raise your shield at the right time, you block the attack. The next attack where you're going to raise your shield again is going to get a bonus to blocking.
I actually think it would be interesting if each of the realms classes had some slightly different ways that blocking worked. For
Yeah.
instance, Arthurians are notably tanky and like to just absorb tons of damage. So maybe Arthurian tanks or Arthurian heavy fighters have some incentive to keep up, just stay immobile and keep the shield up, and they get bonuses from that or something. Whereas perhaps the Vikings might have some blocking system that might be more conducive to their aggressive style, perhaps more tactical in when they block things, or perhaps they get a damage boost shortly after blocking a ranged attack or something, so they can kind of strategically go, okay, block, and now I've got a damage boost, so throw that down. I'm not sure how they would make it work, but it could be an interesting way to help to differentiate some of those.
Yes.
The Black Knight for the Arthurian has a dash too, and I just mentally in my own mind would very much love to see that shield out with the dash going full speed ahead.
The shield
like a
charge.
battering ram. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, shield charge ability would be nice.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I really want to see, it's to Savardi, I would actually prefer to see AoE damage reduction to everybody involved, to the person that's tanking as well as people behind them. Just basically general, okay, the AoE hits the shield, so it reduces damage to everybody in that vicinity or line or whatever. I just wouldn't want to see it necessarily be like a huge amount of damage reduction. Whereas I think for the interest of long range gap closing, it needs to be a pretty strong damage reduction for single target damage.
Yeah.
But anyway, crap, what was I saying? I got distracted by the chat question. One of the things that chat mentioned that I do want to see is the shield wall concept. I don't think that necessarily needs to be a separate ability, so much as perhaps simply make it so that whenever you have your shield up, if there are other tanks in close proximity who also raise their shield, it might improve the damage mitigation. That way,
Yeah.
That way, so that if you're advancing across an open field, but you're by yourself doing your active blocking, it might be a pretty powerful thing, but it's not really strong. But if you're actually there with several other tanks doing like active blocking, it stacks some to the point where it's like, okay, you're not going to take out their army of people who are shield blocking because they're all kind of buffing each other a little
Shield
bit.
wall.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. And when you're talking about magic, which is usually the solution for all of the problems they talk about, you can start to add in other things like shield bubbles on people, buffs that help mitigate damage for friendly players, not yourself. Making you more of a utility tank than true damage blocking tank. There's a lot they could do with it.
Yeah. One of the things I did want to talk about is other means for tanking, because as I think Bran mentioned, or Kriss mentioned, somebody mentioned it earlier, one of the reasons tanking is difficult in RVR games is you can't just taunt somebody and force them to attack you. I mean, some games have done that, but it's really annoying. And they've already said they're really not going to do that. So you need means of doing it. And I don't hate it, but I don't love the idea of I apply the taunt and it debuffs you unless you're hitting me. It's like a kind of a cop-out move. It's like the lazy way of going about it.
Yeah, that's how most people have sold it.
I did want to talk about alternative means for them providing that tanking role. And this is where I think we really get into the melee combat, because this doesn't apply at range so much. But when you're in melee, how do you get people to hit you instead of hitting the healer?
It's totally the aspect of messing with someone's willpower, forcing them to believe that you are the biggest threat and that you need to go down first. Yep. Healers are traditionally that person. So if you as a tank if you can get close and be up front in people's faces, that's usually good enough reason for you to kind of avoid doing what you were doing to focus on this guy whacking you in the face.
Collision certainly helps with that, and the physics, being able to knock people back, knock them around, and
the disruption damage that you can do with the shield.
Yeah, I think the thing that really stands out, some people were talking about heavy fighters needing to be able to do tons of damage regardless of how tanky they are and everything, because otherwise, how do you build that threat? I really think the disruption is where the threat is. I actually, if I'm playing a heavy fighter, I actually don't care about doing damage as much as I would love to be really tanky and just do tons of disruption damage. And just while someone's hitting the healer, I could just get up behind him and go, "Oh, you would like to stab, would you?" No. "Oh, you're trying to stab my healer again?" No. Not allowed.
Yeah. And this is
give the tanks the chain stun, and that'll be annoying enough for everybody to focus on them.
Yeah. It doesn't even have to be a hard stun, just interrupting the attacks.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And that makes a already slow-paced combat even slower for that person trying to get off casts or get off abilities, and it really gets annoying for them, and they're just going to be like, "Okay, you got my attention."
That's one of my favorite things about playing a melee class is playing something that has a lot of CC that is not necessarily like stun lock, just really irritating.
Yep.
And then there's the one thing that everyone's capable of doing, which is body blocking. You don't have to be a heavy fighter to do it. You can be a healer and do self-heals, and you can technically be a tank by being a healer and just taking the damage.
Face tanking.
Yeah. And that's just the natural thing that everyone can do.
Yeah.
And technically everyone can wear a shield if they have the strength requirement to do it. Doesn't mean they will, because that'll mean sacrificing other priority stats for them.
Especially depending on your class.
And I would hope that heavy fighters have some bonuses or something that make them better at active blocking than anyone else is.
You can do shouts. That's a common thing in other games. Shouts that do disruption debuffs, or just general overall flat attack damage debuffs. Not one that, as you mentioned earlier, unless they target you, they get full damage, but just a flat debuff, like everyone, due to this shout, does less damage. Almost like an aura, but that would be more of the bard thing.
Well, the Black Knight already has a shout, so
yeah. And there are certainly things they could do, like tanking and gap closing doesn't necessarily have to fall entirely on heavy fighters. There are certain abilities they can have. Mages have abilities to create walls or other barriers that prevent ranged attacks and things like that over at least small areas, to help close that distance. They could have other classes have abilities. And of course, support's going to have the speed buffs to help close that gap. So even if the heavy fighters have like a 10% speed debuff when they're blocking, but then they've got the bard giving them a 20% speed
Yeah.
buff for moving forward, you know, they're still going to be moving faster.
You know, countering this whole concept of how do you get hit as a tank in this, if tanks have the ability, or some of them at least, to increase their damage output through getting hit, through the more damage that they mitigate, like the Black Knight does, the idea would be to not hit them, to counter them. So, which takes away the whole idea of them even being the tank.
Yes.
Yeah. And but the thing that I get concerned about, that I really don't want to see, is, well, there's two things. One is, like I mentioned, the long range firing line, where there's not any incentive to be the one who actually starts advancing forward aggressively, and people just stand at back with the healers healing the fighters while they block, while the long range people shoot. And then the second thing is people just spamming tons of ranged characters and really foregoing melee combat because they go, well, we don't need it so much because they can't even close gaps very well. So we could just stay at range and kill everybody, and then we close gap because everyone's dead.
And that's where we enter the topic of why stealth needs to be in the game.
We've kind of abused that though. But
I digress.
I would love because they've hinted at some charge abilities, but I would love a
but haven't they also said
Reinhardt style shield charge?
But haven't they also said that they don't really want them to have long range, like gap closers, to just charge in and dash all the way back and forth across the field?
Well, if it has enough cooldown, you don't charge away all across the field. But having a charge where you can't move, you can't steer yourself, it's a straight line with your shield up, and you can't dodge anything. So if they attack you from the side, you take full damage. You're only protected from the front. It's still a good gap closer, and it's a good attention grabber, because when a heavy melee arrives at close range, you want to focus on it.
Yeah, I would say
range gets kind of negated.
Well, I would say the only problem with that is then your ranged people are unprotected, and their ranged people can just take them out from cover.
Well, that's the trade-off.
Yeah, I'm just saying, it's like if you can't safely engage across that distance, or at least semi-safely, then it becomes too difficult to do so. Or the solution is you have to have twice as many fighters, and that's kind of another concern. Is, are we just going to end up with massive tons of heavy fighters, because some of them are going to be DPS heavy fighters and some of them are going to be tanky heavy fighters, so we have to have twice as many? Because that brings up an interesting question for chat. In chat, how many of you are planning on playing a heavy fighter as your main character? Because I will say that I polled people in my guild recently,
and there's not a lot of people.
Zero.
It was on my list of one of the things.
There's a number of people who are willing to play heavy fighter, and they're like, if we don't have any, I'll play heavy fighter. There's like plenty of those people, but no one's really eyeing for it. Like, yes, I'm going to be the heavy fighter.
To follow up that question,
it's more like a default,
because there is a class limit when we first start the launch. Is heavy fighter, if you're playing it, intended to still be your main when the other classes come out?
Yeah,
and that is the thing as well. Which I don't think that's as much of an issue, because, some of the people who are doing DPS heavy fighter, surely when Shapeshifter comes out, they're going to go, oh, Shapeshifter time, or go to Stealther or whatever. And that just leaves the ones that want to be tankier, which I think is fine.
I think we'll see a division, and hopefully a healthy division between your DPS tanks, which will be the ones who go up front and rush in, and I think your tanky heavy fighters will play more of a defensive role, hanging back to just do protection.
And see, this is the other concern I have, I guess. So far, it looks like only one person in chat has said that they're going heavy fight. They plan to really go heavy fighter, and that's only because stealthers aren't in. And that's my problem. I'm like, I actually think heavy fighters are pretty cool. If I don't. I would play a heavy fighter if I wasn't really wanting to play an archer. And so, given that we don't have any, I may end up playing a heavy fighter anyway.
You probably will.
But that's the thing. They've put them out, and I do think they're pretty cool. But unless they make them a lot more cool, I don't think anyone's going to want to roll them.
Yeah. They need to make melee combat more desirable. Because right now they've been focusing on range a lot.
specifically for the Arthurians, because we are the more traditional realm,
Yes.
it's going to feel a lot more familiar to us, and we're
Yeah.
going to be like, oh, eh. While the
Just a
Mjolnir,
tank. Yeah.
a completely different style of
Mew
tank
Mew.
that you don't see too often. Mew
Yeah.
Mew, yeah. And so that realm will have more incentive to have them than ours will,
Yeah.
because we're just so
Ours
normal.
is just tanks, and the problem is people are nowadays, after so many games where tanks are useless in PvP.
Yeah.
People are very jaded about
That's true.
tanks,
That's
and
true.
they're like, I'm gonna roll a tank, and people are just gonna rush around me and go for the squishies, and I'm gonna be useless.
Yeah, I don't
Well,
think
that's
that's going to
why-
be
So
the
they need to
case
make
in this
them a lot
game.
more desirable.
But I don't think people are going to start switching until they show that, until they really
Yes.
show that
Yeah.
heavy fighters are going to be capable of that, and they haven't in any capacity. In fact, I would say up to this point, all it's really done is reinforce the concerns about range damage
Yes.
and range effectiveness. I do think, Svarty, that heavy fighters will be very flexible in their builds. I think people are either going to be able to be pretty DPS-y, probably not doing as much as a mage or an archer, but still beefy as a bruiser character, or they'll be able to go really kind of almost like true tank style. But still, not a lot of people really focus on it. And I agree, because they're not really focusing on gameplay itself, because that's not the part of the testing we're really into.
Not yet.
Yeah. Not yet.
But even still, you would expect to see some people wanting to play fighters.
No.
It seems to be very minuscule, which is a little bit alarming. Speaking
It's
of
kind of
tankiness,
worrying. Yeah.
Given what we know, the focus on ranged attacks, the lack of stealthers that are for launch, how beefy, how tanky, or tough do healers themselves need to be? How tough should they be? Should they be, because they're supposed to be really powerful, should they be glass cannon healers, or should they have a certain degree of toughness to them?
That is going to be a different answer for each realm.
Yeah.
I think that the empath needs to actually be tougher, because it uses its own life force to heal, versus the two mobile healers for the Arthurians, and then your stone healers with the Vikings, because they're much more mobile. To counter that mobility, they do need to have less health overall.
Yeah.
I would say that if you're having to use your own health as a resource, you're still pretty squishy. So even if you do start with more health, you're still going to end up being about the same, because you're burning your own health for resources.
It correlates to that effect, yes, but
yeah.
I think they'll be a little beefier, flat out taking damage.
I think what I would like to see is that healers have a moderate health pool. They're not super squishy health-wise and tankiness-wise. They can take a little bit of damage, but they are incredibly susceptible to interruption.
Yes.
And slows and things of that nature, so that stealthers especially, but also heavy fighters who get up on them, can take a healer down quickly if they're left alone, but people aren't going to be one-shotting them just because the heavy fighter moved away. Because I think that's the concern, is if you make them too squishy, then people are just going to be like, oh, look, these two archers just go, and two-shot, and the healer goes down, because the heavy fighter wandered off or dashed away to go deal with somebody. They have to be able to take a hit or two, or a couple of hits. But if somebody's like, basically, I think healers should be skewed towards being very weak to melee damage.
Yeah.
Yeah, the idea being that if you're being focused as a healer, if you are the healer and you are being focus fired, you should not ever be able to have the chance to out heal the damage coming in.
Yeah.
At least on in melee range.
Yes.
Yeah.
Someone's up in your face.
At least on yourself. If you're being ignored, you can out heal someone else's damage on someone else. I think that's good, especially if they're heavily armored, like a heavy fighter.
It's true that the physicians might be the shortest range of them all in terms of healing, so you might need a bit of survivability, but it should still be you should still have to rely on the other classes to keep you alive as a healer.
One of the things that I thought of is, and kind of some of the thoughts behind these range dynamics, and the reason heavy fighters need to be pretty tough, is it occurred to me that with so many ranged combatants and classes in the game, it feels like healers are actually going to need to stay very close to the front line. And the heavy fighters, because if they get left by the heavy fighters, they're wide open for anybody to bombard the crap out of and kill them. If they're standing out in the field by themselves, they die.
Well,
Yeah.
there are other classes that can fill that role, I feel. The hybrid classes, especially the hybrid melee classes and hybrid magic damage classes. The Abbot for the Arthurians is at least depicted as a kind of magic melee DPS. It still has some range to it, but also the heals works great with other healers, co-healing. You don't necessarily need the heavy knight to be that role.
Well, then who's going to block them from damage, though, if the heavy fighters left them and they're just standing in the middle of the field with archers?
I mean, that certainly helps as far as blocking them, but they can be working together with other classes and not a heavy knight and still be a little bit protected through just the other forms of natural blocking.
Yeah, I was just thinking of group composition and building teams for like our guild. And I was like, if we're going to go and we're attacking a keep, would we have our healers standing back with all the archers, or we have them in the front line with the heavy fighters? Well, the heavy fighters are going to need the most healing probably, and they're the only ones that can keep the damage off of the healers. But then if the healers are in the front line, they're going to be taking AoE damage and everything anyway. But they at least couldn't be focus fired, whereas if they're in the back, all the ranged combatants can focus fire them. So it seems to me like you would want most of your healers up at the front lines area. I mean, I guess they can stand behind archers, but it just seems like it's much more
archers
likely
can body block at least also.
It's very meta.
Much more likely they're going to
composition.
get flanked and focus fired if they're standing out in the back.
If, in my opinion, any group of 8, which is at the moment our standard group size, if you have less than 2 healers, you're doing it wrong. You're going to want 2 healers, and at that point you can share the workload. And you have other classes that do have the capability of doing sub healing, like the Abbot, for Arthurians at least.
Yeah, but I don't think you want to have a healer and then a dedicated hybrid healer whose job is to just heal the healer.
Oh, it's not, but it's supplemental, and that's all PvP is reacting to the situation. Yeah. So you can deal DPS as an Abbot, which is something I'll be playing, but then also throw in some off heals if you see that they're needed.
Yeah.
So they can fill the role of helping out as kind of mitigating damage in that tankiness discussion we're talking about. But
yeah, do you think that line of sight, player collision of abilities is something that they can use in the game to prevent the risk of the long range firing line sort of encounter where people just stay at range and just start exchanging shots?
Yeah, not just that, and
absolutely
projectile travel time. If you're firing an arrow right now, you don't see the arrows coming very well. When the game goes live, you're gonna see the arrows coming. You can move to avoid them. If they come from very far, you can see them long before they hit you, and you can just step on the side, and they don't guide. It's not guided missiles, so they go in a straight line.
I was actually referring to them using not actually doing damage with friendly fire, but friendly player collision. Your fighter standing in front of the archer, not being able to shoot through them. So that prevents them from basically just going, okay, we've got line, archers just shooting at each other crazy. Like, it would kind of force some melee action from the fighters because just from sheer physics. Unless I guess you're on hills, but then the fighters aren't able to block anyway. So everyone's tiered down a hill.
And that brings up an interesting thought about melees going into range with other melees, trying to get through the melee wall if you're colliding with them. If there is player collision, so you actually have to work at trying to find your way around any kind of obstacle, and that makes it that much harder for melee to do that job.
Yeah, we're also on the basis of closing the gap. One thing I think all of us, me first, forget is that we're used to combat being top targeted.
Hmm.
So if you move left or right, the arrows follow, the spell follows, and you get hit anyway as long as you've been targeted. It's not going to be the case in CU.
Eh,
So
Some
actual
of it will be.
some of it, but it's still you still have a a way to dodge the majority of the damage while you're running towards the range fighters.
I agree. I think that I do somewhat agree. I think that the inability of abilities to just track is, of course, going to be a factor that has to be considered. At really, I with large scale battles, and that's where a lot of these things about closing gaps really comes in, because if it's a 8 man versus 8 man, there's really not as much concern about
No.
people getting super focus fired down at
Yeah.
long range. But we're talking about whole groups, whole team, large groups of like 40 mans fighting each other. Uh, I don't think people are really going to have that much ability to jump out of the way, especially when it comes to like fighters, because they have people to worry about behind them. If they're diving out of the way, they don't know if that arrow is coming towards them or not. They just have to active block and keep going forward. They've the healer can try to active dodge, but if the fighter active dodges, he might have a pissed off healer behind him when he takes an arrow to the face because the fighter just
Yeah.
moved out of the way.
Yeah. I mean, if you're talking about like 40v40, the group doing the assaulting, let's say they have a lot of mages. Those mages aren't even really looking at individuals at that point. They're just like, there's a big group of people, gonna hurl all my fireballs or my furthest range magic that does AoE into that mass group. There's gonna be a
Yeah.
lot of those coming, and it's gonna be hard to dodge 15 of those things just lobbing up and down. Like
Yeah.
that becomes your whole action basically in that fight is just keeping an eye on those things coming down and trying to avoid it.
Yeah. Well,
You know,
it's
It's
possible.
messy.
Yeah,
I just
it's
had
going to
a
be messy.
super
And
random thought. Go ahead.
what?
Go
No, go
ahead.
ahead.
No, I just someone was mentioning line of sight. I just had a super random thought. I was like, I wonder if any mages are going to have illusion spells, and I can just make an illusionary tree in the middle of the field to help us move up. Everyone cast tree illusion.
No, but you can cast water and fireball and make a steam wall, and they don't have line of sight.
Yeah, quite possibly. I was just saying
Possibly.
that
The
would be
medieval
a feasible
Well,
thing
the
for
medieval
like
smoke grenade.
a feasible
where
thing for
manual
like
aiming comes in.
druids or
Yeah.
TDD mages to cast like tree, like grow temporary tree and get some kind of a way to help again move them up into close range, since they are supposed to be more somewhat more agile and hit and run style. They're gonna have to have some ways to really utilize line of sight and things of that nature.
Yeah.
I don't know. It was just a random thought. I was like, illusion's a thing we haven't really seen in an MMO much at all.
True.
That would be interesting. Just and we've seen that they're willing to use walls and things of that nature. So it takes a few years to summon a line of trees. So did y'all have any other topics, or is there anything that chat's particularly interested in talking about when it comes to heavy fighters?
Panic.
Now, panic is an interesting concept. Of course, we don't really know a lot about how it's.
We don't.
Yeah.
We
gonna
know
work.
certain abilities generate panic, and then the receiving end of that, you gain panic. And once that panic, I guess, reaches a cap, you more or less, it sounds like, kind of lose control of your character and start
Yeah,
running
like a
away
fear
like a
spell.
fear.
Yeah.
And I think that could be a nice combination with a melee trying to get into range. Over time, that panic grows, and eventually everyone's scattered and they can go in. But haven't seen much on that.
Yeah.
No,
I do think
we haven't.
one area to consider differently is the smaller fights. We often talk in terms of large scale battles, and I think that the primary reason for that is one, that's what I think of. But also because that's what the game's marketed on. The game is marketed on massive scale RVR. Yes, there's going to be small fights. There's going to be little skirmishes and battles that happen. But really, the main consequential fights are going to be these big open world battles, keep sieges and everything. I don't want the game to turn into just massive keep sieges. But that's what they're gearing the tech for, is to be able to really do that for those truly momentous occasions. But things will work differently in smaller fights. And so that's a consideration too, is how do things work differently when we're not talking about 40 versus 40. We're only talking about 8 versus 8. There's one, maybe 2 heavy fighters in a group.
It becomes more of a competitive nature on the smaller scales. Large scale battles are messy. There's less thought to them. It's more reactionary, more of there's a lot of people going to do this awesome thing that hits a lot of people. Typically, it ends up in a range versus range kill fest. Smaller scale battles, you start seeing more of the individual characteristics of each class start to shine, I think. And you'll see a lot more happening with heavy fighters in particular. They'll be able to get in quickly. They'll be able to position themselves more easily. Less of everything we've talked about, basically. There's less of it to worry about.
Yeah.
I actually feel like that's where you really see, or more likely to see, the moderately tanky or more DPS focused heavy fighters to be more useful, is in those smaller scale skirmishes and fights where they don't have that many people to worry about protecting. Yes, they've got to still guard their healer, but only from a small number of people. You can keep an eye on those people real quick. It's much more about who's doing the DPS quicker, taking people out.
It becomes more traditional PvP.
Strategic.
Where it's more strategic, more target calling, shorter time to kill, things like that. So it becomes more strategic and more traditional PvP, where a tank becomes once again this useless spot on the group because everybody's going to go around them in skirmishes.
Unless they get those nice dash charge moves and disruption.
Exactly.
It still could be useful. I wouldn't say they're useless.
Disruption is still useful because if you're a heavy disruption focused character, you can still be a pain in the ass and be the focus of the other group. But it becomes character are going to need to be a bit more versatile in smaller skirmishes than in big battles.
Coordination and focus firing is also very important in those skirmish fights. They're still important in large scale battles, but I feel like in the small scale skirmishes and battles, you really effective focus firing can really shift how things are turning. Because there's only going to be like one fighter to block people. So if you switch around to somebody else, you've got enough people to potentially take them out pretty quickly.
All things being equal, if you put 2 scenarios together, 2 groups of the same size on a small scale and 2 groups of the same size on a larger scale, you're going to see a lot more of that camouflage and stealth and guerrilla tactics coming into play with the smaller scale, where you can get the advantage and get a surprise attack in, and really focus on allowing that to kind of dictate how you move around the territories and everything. Versus a large scale, it's a lot harder for you to move around with 40, 50 people running together with you. You get noticed.
Yeah, what I would like to see, since people, we're kind of talking about charging and stuff, I actually don't want to see any kind of long range charge or movement enhancement ability from heavy fighters for 2 reasons. One, I think it kind of defeats the purpose of the heavy fighter when it comes to long range combat. They're even if they're not tanking, they're kind of supposed to be protecting people. If you're charging out at super high speeds, you're leaving your group. I think that'll actually be detrimental to large group fights because you'll have some people who are just stupidly charging out by themselves. Also, it kind of defeats the whole purpose of having the support class who can cast movement speed buffs if the heavy fighter can just go, oh, look, I can buff myself, pew, and run off. So I really kind of hope they don't do that. I would like to see close range charges where you can turn and maybe it's only like 10 meters and you just go, hey, you, and you go and jump out. Or maybe not 10 meters, but like 3 meters. You just jump out real quick, hit that relatively close target, especially because that actually caters towards the protective abilities because you can venture out a little bit, but as soon as someone runs after your healer, you can turn back around and defensively charge back in to interrupt.
Ultimately depends on whether or not their charged is target based. If it's freeform charge, sure, you can totally do that. But if you have to actually be targeting someone and the intent is to rush forward to deal damage to them, then that will start to limit that idea heavily.
Yeah, I still, I would prefer a pretty close proximity limit so that they have to kind of stay close to their people. I just don't want to see, tanks, or not tanks, but heavy fighters running off by themselves. Because again, we do have to consider the future of the game. They're talking about including stealthers, shapeshifters. We won't have those at launch, but those are both, from what we've seen of them, supposed to be very roaming, very independent, sort of high DPS type characters, very mobile. It doesn't make sense to me to have the heavy fighter also be very mobile.
Yeah, we shall see. What I absolutely don't want to see, you were talking about like people going forward by themselves, and in other MMOs, most recently, one that we've played, SWTOR, had pulls, character pulls to pull people to you from long range. There's been no mention of that, no samples on any of the classes so far, which is good. Yeah, I'm not either.
I'm not a big fan either.
But that'll kind of change how melee people start to think, because I know, especially in SWTOR, that was always a factor of, if I get too close, I'm going to get pulled. Even if I stay within my group, I can get pulled if someone runs out. You don't have to worry about that.
But getting that done to you is really frustrating.
Yeah. But it changes kind of just the mentality of melee, that they can creep up a little more with some safety to them, hopefully.
Yeah, I think that pulls are fun to use, but ultimately do not fit very well in this type of game where we're supposed to be. This game to me emphasizes group coordination, large scale battles, and small skirmishes as well, but still a higher level of group coordination. It's balanced towards group cooperation, not towards an individual being really powerful and a single player's player skill. Everyone needs to be skilled, but they need to be also skilled in working together. And it doesn't really, just the idea of being able to grab a single person and yank them out of formation kind of runs counter to that to me. So if they were to put that in the game, I would be kind of irritated because I think it would be too powerful. You've got these tanks and stuff, people who have strategically positioned themselves to defend their allies, and someone can just run up and go, yoink! Nope, you're not doing that, even though you spent all this time putting it together.
On the other hand, they did talk about the difference in mass and how you can push people around. So if I have a giant heavy fighter or a golem heavy fighter, and I rush into human heavy fighters, and I charge them, I should be able to break that wall, unless they have the bonus of the shield or something. But a human smaller heavy fighter actively blocking, if I rush into them, I should be able to move them and break that formation.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is actually one type of pull I just thought about that I actually might be willing or even interested to see, now that you mentioned that, would be a realistic slow pull based on mass. So if somebody if you hooked a heavy fighter and you started slowly pulling them forward, they've got a lot of mass. If their mass is close to yours, you're not going to be able to pull them. But what if the heavy fighters were moved out of the way and you grabbed a healer or an archer and you started slowly dragging them out of the line towards your group, and you're just like pulling them in steadily?
Make it based off of the strength stat.
all their allies would either have to rush forward to block them or just go, well, you're screwed.
So you
Now,
could
I could kind of get
initiate-
behind that.
You could initiate that, and then if you happen to hit someone who had more strength than you, it kind of turns around and you start getting pulled towards them. And, no.
But I also think, having it be based on mass, so you can't do it against other tanky, fightery type characters. It really has to be like I see a squishy person and I want them, so yoink, and I'm slowly pulling them over.
I like Skylar's idea. If you have less mass, you actually pull yourself towards them.
And then also having it be kind of slow, so it's not like a grab and immediately pull them towards you, but you're moving them at their movement speed towards you. And so all their people have to watch them as they're slowly being dragged to their doom.
The guy being pulled just turns around and you just see him doing the run animation and you go nowhere.
He's like, no, no, no. And they're just like, yes. And
then you can have a heavy fighter coming and just cutting the rope.
Imagine how terrible you would feel if you were the heavy fighter that was supposed to be protecting them and you moved out of the way and they got hooked and they're getting dragged through the line. And you turn around and you're like, oh, shit. I'm coming to get you. I'm coming to get you. That would be kind of funny.
Never going to happen.
No.
Probably not, but I might be interested in that sort of ability. That would be kind of interesting.
I would, with the mass system and everything, I would love to have, as an Arthurian, I would roll a heavy fighter just to have Lutrapan pinball.
Yeah.
You charge into a line of Lutrapans.
They're going to hate every race.
Just the Lutrapan. I have no love for Lutrapan.
Nope.
All right, so
That's Donnie's fault.
we've kind of murdered that topic a little bit. So, but does anybody else have anything they wanted to discuss with heavy fighters before we kind of round that out? I got hiccups.
Nothing that we haven't already touched upon, other than that I hope, very, very much hope, that this game does not become the ranged dominant.
Yes.
Yeah,
Kill
I don't
fest.
really feel like it will, because I feel like ultimately, if there's too many ranged people, a lot of people will go, okay, well, I'm going to go fighters, because they will be required to make fighters more powerful if no one's playing them, and then they'll become really powerful, and a lot of people will switch to them. And I think over time, it will balance itself out. I think ultimately the problem and concern is what happens at launch. If it ends up being tons of range, and then at launch the initial first 2 weeks are super ranged heavy, the reviews about the game and everything are going to really tank hard. So we know how those launch impressions go.
You mentioned one of the key words with trying to incentivize people to play something that is currently underperforming or just not
meta.
popular. Time. The time it takes to progress as a character, your horizontal progression. People may not want to switch to a tank if it means spending another 2 months getting to the same competitive point on that character versus the one they're already on.
Yeah, that's going to be a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I think. Also, I think the initial population probably won't be a concern for launch, because we'll have tons of time. A lot of us will have tons of time in beta testing to see how it's going to play out, and then we go, oh, there's ridiculous amounts of range, so we really need to figure out more with fighters, and we're going to have to switch out and do stuff like I've said, looking at the polls and stuff. If it continues to the point where everyone's playing mages, healers, crafters, and archers, I'm probably going to switch off an archer into heavy fighter, just like I do in every other MMO, because no one wants to play a tank.
Yeah, but that would be for me, that would be a failure on CSC's part.
It would be, because it's their job to make it interesting.
They need to make. They came up with so many cool abilities and cool stuff for range. They need to do the same for melee. Otherwise, nobody's going to want to play melee.
Not everyone's weird like me and just really likes being a tanky guy with a big shield.
Tanky. Yeah, I want to see very soon, I think, maybe a little further into beta, an official class poll on just the release classes, on what everyone intends to play, knowing that they have to choose from a limited source.
Yeah. At any rate, we're about to beat it to death. So I do want to thank everybody for coming and hanging out with us. We will be back in 2 weeks for episode 59. We don't know what that topic's going to be yet, but
We'll
we
get
will be
there
back.
eventually.
So we'll make our usual announcement and everything, and hopefully we'll see some people in testing. Hopefully sometime soon we'll be able to stream testing or something. That would be cool, but there's been no word on that, and I really don't expect it anytime soon. So thanks, everybody.